The Cat Club, in association with Henry Smith Brewery, presents Abbey Road Revisited. Greetings! In October 2019, the Cat Club's featured album was Abbey Road by the Beatles. Our special guest was the acclaimed author and Beatles aficionado Tony Barrell. It was a terrific evening. Now, our friend Jason Barnard of Strange Brew, in an exclusive interview, has spoken during this lockdown period to Tony about the album. That interview now follows. A splendid time is guaranteed for all.
I think the first recordings for Abbey Road were only a few weeks after the Get Back sessions.
That's right. It's amazing when you look at the timeline. They played the rooftop concert on the 30th of January 1969, which I'm pretty attached to. And only 3 weeks later, they were in Trident Studios round the corner, recording "I Want You, She's So Heavy," and going really loud, and there were complaints. It's a tiny, St Anne's Court, it's a tiny street in Soho, and there were complaints from somebody who was working. It was quite late at night, and somebody announced, "I'm sorry, we've had some complaints," and I think John Lennon said, "What are they doing working at this hour? What this time?" So plus ça change. They had complaints for playing on the roof in Savile Row, and now people are complaining about the noise in the studio as well.
And this was the time when they asked George Martin back as producer.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he was frozen out slightly, wasn't he, for the Get Back project, which became Let It Be, and he didn't much care for that. I mean, he didn't want them really. He didn't like the idea of them going back to their roots and just playing live all the time. He loved producing them, and he loved, putting all the production tricks on the albums. And he wanted, and Paul just suddenly phoned him and said, we want to do another album. And he said something like, what the way we used to do them, And Paul said, yeah, that's exactly what we want to do. And he said, well, even John wants to do that. And Paul said, yeah. So that was an agreement. And I mean, I think George Martin was overjoyed that he could do another album with them and produce some fantastic sounds.
And the band in this final period, even though there were some arguments, got on better?
Well, I think so. I mean, I personally think, because I've studied the rooftop concert, that they were quite overjoyed by that concert, and that it was a test of it was a kind of self-audition, if you like. It was a test that could be played live again, because they hadn't played live for 885 days when they played the rooftop concert. They hadn't played since '66 to the public. They'd done a lot of jamming in the studio, but jamming in the studio and playing to a few engineers and so on is not quite the same as playing to an audience, a live audience. So I think they were overjoyed by the fact that they could still cut it, live, and they were still writing. They weren't terribly prolific. Paul was probably the most prolific, and George actually. But Paul and George probably the most prolific writers at this point. Although George was having a lot of his songs rejected by the rest of the band and was a little bit upset about that. Paul was still knocking tunes out. I mean, some of the stuff on Abbey Road comes from stuff they'd done at Twickenham, for the Get Back project. But they were kind of rubbing against each other. They were there's a faction now, with the Peter Jackson film coming out soon. There's a faction of people who say, well, actually, all those sessions at Twickenham and everything, they were having fun. They were playing live for the first time in ages together, and they were just having fun. It wasn't the best. It wasn't the best time of their lives. They weren't having the time of their lives. John later said, he hated having all these cameras up his nose and it was misery and everything. And Ringo called it a nightmare and everything. So it had been a bad time, but when they got back in the studio, I think they're finding a bit of joy again.
Yeah. You've kind of talked a little bit about how there's more warmth around the band, but actually in terms of the technical aspect, the sound of the album is quite warm.
Yeah, the sound is very interesting. It sounds like no other Beatles album, does it? And that's partly because Abbey Road had a new transistorized recording console installed sort of late '68, So the old tube mixers were going out. They were going out the back door, and this transistoride recording console made everything sound very, very different. In fact, they struggled in the early days with it. I think Jeff Emmerich said at one point in his book that there were some long faces during the first few days of recording Abbey Road because they weren't getting the sounds they were used to. You know, the old tube consoles, the old tube desks, they had a sort of dirty, rough sound that you can get distortion quite easy on them. You know, you get a lovely distortion like you get on the guitar of Revolution or something. But they were getting sounds that were a bit too clean for them. So but the Beatles were really good at getting used to new things. They were brilliant at doing that. So they got used to it, and they got used to knowing what to play and how to play. But the other reason I think it sounds different is you've got a fantastic set of instruments going on. You've got some great guitar sounds. George is playing a Les Paul as well as his Fender Rosewood Telecaster, which he played on the Roof. Paul is playing. He's gone back to a bass that he was given in 1964. He went back to his Rickenbacker bass. So he's playing that. That sounds. I think the Rickenbacker bass kind of almost makes the album, together with Ringo's drums. So Ringo's playing his Ludwig Hollywood kit with maple shells, again, which he played on the Roof. And that sounds. The drums are recorded and separated in stereo for the first time. And I think it's Ringo's best Beatles album. You can just sit there and I was listening to the drums today. I put on Something. I was just listening to what Ringo was playing, and on Something, you know, he gives that floor tom such a welly. You know, he's bashing away at that floor tom, and it really helps the song.
Absolutely.
So it was the equipment, and it was all the equipment really that kind of made it, and their brilliance that made it what it made it sound the way it does.
You talked about the bass and drums there, and it'd be good to go into the track by track now. But the start of Come Together, the bass and drums in harmony there, it's a great way to kick off the album. Yeah,
it is. You've got some nice hi-hat from Ringo, and you've it sort of tries to disguise the fact that the song was parts of the song were a little bit pinched from Chuck Berry. You know, John obviously loved Chuck Berry's "You Can't Catch Me," with the line, you know, "Here come a flat top, he was moving up with me," and he pinched that. And I think Paul recognised that, but you know, we tried to disguise the whole thing with a really interesting arrangement. And Paul's playing some quite cool, quite sparing electric piano on that, and it's basically in D minor, you know, but Paul's messing around with the seventh and the sixth. He's playing C and B in D minor, which is interesting. So he makes it more complex, and the bass is lovely, isn't it? It's just a kind of really, really sort of rubbery, funky bass sound that he puts on that, and it sounds like nothing else they did actually in the end. It was originally it came from John trying to write a campaign song for Timothy Leary, you know, the famous LSD guy, when he was standing for governorship of California against Ronald Reagan. And John was playing around with the idea at the bed-in that he and Yoko did in Montreal. And in the end, Leary didn't take the song. He didn't want it. And John decided, well, this is quite a reasonable song. So he finished it off with what he described as gobbledygook. So it's all that, you know, Walrus Gumboot stuff, which reminds me rather of, Glass Onion or something on the White Album.
Yeah, it's got that brilliant lyrical imagery that works.
Yeah, it completely works. It goes with the music, and we don't mind that it's nonsense. Actually, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people who interpreted all the lyrics and thought they weren't nonsense at all, and were kind of treating them as instructions.
And you've talked about John taking element of Chuck Berry for Come Together, but there's a little bit of a link of George Harrison writing something with James Taylor's Something in the Way She Moves.
That's right. Yeah, the Something pinches a bit of James Taylor's album, which he would have definitely known because it was on Apple, and he was kind of involved in that. And something the way she moves, but he makes it his own, doesn't he? And James Taylor, being the nice guy he is, didn't mind. He said, "Oh, I'm quite honoured actually." He said he's quite flattered by that. So that was lucky. But there's something is an absolute beautiful song, isn't it? It's and it's not just the song; it's the way it sounds and the way it was produced. You've got strings conducted by George Martin. You've got George playing two different guitars, not at the same time. He wasn't playing a double neck. He was playing that crunchy rhythm sound he gets on his Rosewood Telecaster, and the solo, the lovely melodic kind of leapy solo he was played on his Les Paul. For a little while, something had an instrumental section at the end with John Lennon playing bits of piano, but that was dropped, unfortunately. I think that would have been a bit odd. It's quite a busy bass line from Paul on that, but it really worked. Magical, and there's that famous line from Frank Sinatra that it's the best love song written in the 20th century or something, and he thought it was by John and Paul. He thought it was Lennon McCartney's song. George, interestingly, said when he wrote it, he imagined someone like Ray Charles doing it, so he could hear Ray Charles singing the vocals. So he was trying to do a kind of Ray Charles impersonation, which doesn't come off. But, it was a way into creating that song.
Was that a double A-side with Come Together?
Yeah, it was kind of, wasn't it? Because Something was released as a single with Come Together on the B-side, which was extraordinary, wasn't it? George having an A-side in the Beatles and John's song going on the B-side, even though it starts the album. It's interesting, that, isn't it? Interesting choice. But John Lennon said, he thought at one point Something was the best song on the album. So, they loved it. They were coming round to George. George was maturing, obviously, as a writer, and they were starting to really love what he was doing.
Yeah, it'd have been very interesting if the Beatles had have carried on for a few more years and more of George's material would have come in.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there's that tape, isn't there, which has been played at events by Mark Lewison, of them talking about maybe doing another album after Abbey Road, and they're talking about giving equal space to songs by John, Paul, and George, which is really interesting, isn't it? And that meeting they had that was recorded on that tape has been known about for some time. Actually, it was written about in the 70s by Anthony Fawcett. There's a book by Anthony Fawcett, who was John and Yoko's assistant, and he wrote about that meeting. But yeah, it was interesting that they were actually talking about. I would love to hear another album after Abbey Road, and I think lots of people would have done. We had to make do with the solo albums, which are also, some really good stuff there. But wouldn't it have been great if they'd got together and done another one?
Without Phil Spector's production? Yeah,
with George Martin definitely producing. We're coming on to Maxwell Silverhammer.
What's your take on that?
I've got a lot of people hate that song, including most of the Beatles. Ringo, who's a very patient drummer, got fed up with playing on it. Oh, not this again, and John called it one of Paul's granny songs. It's interesting, isn't it? It's got a kind of 2/4 umpar beat to it. And I think Paul might be channeling, the beer kellers of Hamburg, umpar. At that meeting I was talking about after they did Abbey Road, John said it seemed mad for us to put a song on an album that nobody really dug, including the guy who wrote it. And he was talking about songs like this, like Obladi Oblada, that he didn't like that much. And he was saying that those songs that they didn't really like should be given to other people to record, and they should just get on with recording what they liked, which was a bit of a put down for Paul. But Paul later said Maxwell Silverhammer was his analogy for when something goes wrong out of the blue, as it so often does. And it was a symbolic song, and he created this character called Maxwell with a silver hammer. It's very much a Paul song. Paul often likes to fill his songs with characters, doesn't he? Listen to Band on the Run. I mean, who the hell's Sailor Sam and all that? Admiral Halsey, all those people. Paul's like a playwright as well as a songwriter. He peoples his songs with things in a way that the other Beatles don't tend to do. I mean, John occasionally will put characters in the song, but Paul is full of characters. Well, I don't think Maxwell Silverhammer's too bad. It's got some nice little bits of Moog synthesizer on it, and it's not Rocky Raccoon, is it? It's not as bad as that.
As a song, it works as a pop song, whereas Rocky Raccoon doesn't have much structure.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's okay. I mean, the Abbey Road is a great album, despite Maxwell Silverhammer. I think he gets away with it. It brings variety to the album, looking at it in a positive way. And then we've got Oh Darling, where he redeems himself a bit with a really kind of bluesy, fantastic belter of a song. And he took hours to get that vocal right. He kept coming in early in the morning to try and get the vocal on Oh Darling just right, to make it to get the screaming right and the kind of passion of the song right. And although it's not the most original thing he ever wrote, the performance is fantastic and shows his vocal skills, I think. And the whole production of the thing is brilliant. I like Oh Darling a lot. When I first heard 10cc's debut, Donna, their first single, I thought it owed a bit of a debt to Oh Darling.
Yeah.
Although they used falsetto, instead of Paul's kind of natural vocal.
I heard John wanted to sing it.
Right. I didn't know that. But I'm not surprised because, it's a great rocker and John would have sounded great singing it.
Yeah.
Then you've got Octopus's Garden, which I think is underappreciated.
Definitely.
I think it's Ringo's best contribution to the Beatles in terms of songwriting, and obviously he was helped by George.
Yeah.
But it's a tremendous little bit of fun, that was inspired by. It actually also reminds us of when he left the Beatles, during the White Album, when he walked out. He didn't think he was being appreciated, and ended up in Sardinia on Peter Sellers' yacht, and he was asking for fish and chips, and they didn't really have much fish, and they brought in some seafood instead. They brought in some squid, which he had never had before. So he had squid and chips, I think. And he got talking with the captain and some other people about, and there were stories going around about octopus's gardens, how octopuses build gardens under the sea. They kind of create little rockeries here and there and do kind of like Japanese gardens under the sea. And he was inspired by that, and he started writing the song. Quite a simple thing, very quite simple chords. Now, Ian McMillan, who wrote that fantastic book Revolution in the Head, said it was a poor man's Yellow Submarine.
No.
But I think it's joyful and funny, and there are lines in it like, he'd let us in, knows where we've been, which is hilarious. My mother always used to say, don't touch that, you don't know where it's been. And that's what it reminds me of my mum, And what I love about this Octopus Garden as well is George's really fluid guitar playing on it. He's playing on his lead on his Rosewood Telecaster. Lovely guitar. I've never played one of those, but really quite heavy instrument, but it's got a really great sound. And it's very fluid. George is developing his style so well at this point. And he plays those fantastic solos and riffs on his Rosewood Telecaster on Octopus's Garden, which really makes the song, I think. And but Paul sings a lullaby on side 2, doesn't he, with Golden Slumbers?
Yeah.
But this is Octopus's Garden is like a bedtime story from Ringo, and on side 1, and I love that.
And then a contrast with I Want You, She's So Heavy.
Yeah. As we said, they had complaints when they started recording this at Trident Studios. This was actually partly played on the rooftop as well, which I'm hoping to hear in its. I think the early riffs were just played on the rooftop. I'm hoping to see that in the film, the Peter Jackson film later. But Billy Preston comes in on organ as well on this. Ringo discovers a weird wind machine in the cupboard in Studio 2, I think, and then John starts playing with George's Moog synthesizer to get that extra kind of noisy wind sound and everything. What I love doing towards the end of this track is just turning it up, because you hear Ringo's drums. They really swing on this track towards the end. He sounds almost like Ginger Baker towards the end. Just really fantastic. You turn it really right up in the last 2 minutes, and you'll hear that, I think. It's a very intense song, and I like the way at this point the tracks are bookended by John Lennon songs. We start with Come Together and we finish off with I Want You, and they both bring some guts to this album, which could which might to some people seem a bit of a soft album if they weren't on there, you know. And then after the intensity of I Want You, She's So Heavy, with those George's distorted Les Paul added to John's Epiphone Casino arpeggiation, the intensity then, it suddenly stops because the tape was cut. The tape was actually deliberately cut to make that ending. And then we've got this delightful acoustic guitar arpeggiation coming in, and it's George's Here Comes the Sun. You know, the sun suddenly comes out after that really kind of heavy, doomy sound of I Want You. And Here Comes the Sun is just a burst of joy. The kind of thing the Beatles excelled in, I think, was bursts of joy translated into music. And George is doing it here, which is unusual. You know, his first attempt on a Beatles album was Don't Bother Me, which is quite a bit doomy and a bit down. But Here Comes the Sun. The sun comes out, and it's glorious, isn't it? I love the fact that John Lennon did an interview on Radio Luxembourg and said this song reminds him of Buddy Holly.
Yeah.
And listen to it again with fresh ears and just what John said, and there is a kind of there is a relationship there. That Buddy Holly was really good at writing these sort of leapy melodies, and Here Comes the Sun has got quite a leapy melody and quite but it also has really odd time signatures, doesn't it? It's something it's got sort of half beats in it and things like this, and it's a really interesting song. Written in, of course, as many people know, in Eric Clapton's Sunny Garden at Hurtwood Edge in Surrey. And we still don't know the day on which George wrote this. He was sagging off, was his expression, sagging off from all those tedious meetings about companies the Beatles publishing companies being bought and all this stuff, and Apple and all this stuff, and he just wanted to get away and just get back to what it had been about in the first place, which was writing music and singing music, so he was walking around the garden with one of Eric Clapton's acoustic guitars, and this song just started coming out. The writer Philip Norman said this song sounds like John, which is interesting. So Philip Norman said it sounds like John. John says it sounds like Buddy Holly. But John wasn't on this. John was recovering from a car accident.
Yeah.
They'd had a car accident on July the 1st in Golspie, north of Scotland, and John and Yoko had to have stitches, and John missed Here Comes the Sun, but I wonder what he would have contributed to it.
I don't think John Lennon was a very good driver and passed his test only after a few lessons, which seems a bit suspicious.
No, I don't think he was. I wouldn't get in the car with him. I mean, he had terrible eyesight as well, didn't he? Really bad eyesight. So I don't think he enjoyed driving, and I don't think people enjoyed driving with him. But yeah, that was. Fortunately, they just came out with, with just small injuries, but it could have been much worse. Then on the album we go into Because, which has been written as the prelude to the song cycle that is the medley. It's interesting that it does kind of set things up, doesn't it? It kind of creates this moment of calm in the middle of the album. It's such a beautiful song. And the three of the Beatles are tracked 3 times. That's 3 times 3. So there's a 9-voice choir on there, and the voices are separated beautifully by George Martin, and who was actually instructing different members of the band to sing certain notes at certain times just to get the right effect. What I love about Because as well is that the chords. I don't know if you're a musician, Jason, but if you try to play this on guitar, it's got something like one of the chords in it is like E flat minor 7th flat and 5th. It really is a bugger to play, and that a lot of people forget that John was a chordsmith. Really, Paul knew a hell of a lot of chords, still does know a hell of a lot of chords. John also would come up with really unusual chords for things. Listen to something like Sexy Sadie. It's really interesting, the chords he used in that. And this is amazing. Although John just dismissed it as, oh, it's just Moonlight Sonata backwards. You know, he'd heard Yoko playing Moonlight Sonata by Beethoven on the piano and said, could you play those chords backwards? And she did. And he was inspired by that to write Because, but he's simplifying it too much there, because it's not Moonlight Sonata backwards. It uses, musicologists have looked at this and torn it apart and written pages and pages about this. It's not Moonlight Sonata backwards. It uses some of the same chords. It uses the kind of vibe, and it uses the arpeggiation of Moonlight Sonata. But it's a whole song in its own right, and it's beautiful. And it's you know, it's got some nice harpsichord in there, which John liked because it made it a bit more classical sounding. There's a very good American musicologist called Thomas McFarlane, who's written a whole book about the medley, not about Abbey Road generally, but about the medley, and he calls this the prelude to the medley. And he says, this is a quote from him: in addition to emphasizing the original line and thus thickening the texture, the guitar serves to enhance the expressiveness of the music by expanding its spatio-temporal dimensions. If you like writing like that, you know, which I do actually.
Yeah.
Then you'll love that book. But as he points out, the medley is not really a medley, is it? Because a medley up to this point has been a series of songs put together that we all know. The Beatles used to play medleys of their early hits back in like '64. They used to play a medley of their kind of early hits just to get them out of the way live, and that's what a medley is. A medley is a series of songs that you already know, but this is really a series of songs you don't know in the form of a song cycle. So, but I mean, this is the masterpiece of the album, really, isn't it? The whole medley, and beginning with "You Never Give Me Your Money," which is sort of a sort of heartfelt lament about their finances and the way that lawyers are confusing them, and then we go into Sun King, which is a beautiful thing. John said we decided to be Fleetwood Mac for a few minutes, which is hilarious. You know, clearly he's inspired by Albatross.
Yeah.
Which was, do you know, Albatross was actually #1 when they played on the Roof.
Oh,
interesting,
okay.
isn't it?
Yeah.
That, you know, they would have been listening to that, would have been hearing that. It was everywhere. It was on radio everywhere. Every time you turned on the radio, you heard Albatross. And I like the in Sun King. I like the sort of the foreign lyrics. They throw in phrases that Paul learned a few Spanish words at school, and he's got some Spanish in there. There's some Portuguese in there, like to obrigado, and I like the Liverpool slang as well. Chickaferdy's in there. Chickaferdy. Liverpudlians know that expression. It's kind of, you know, it's when you're mocking somebody for maybe losing a football match or something. You say Chickaferdy, you know, so there kind of thing. So I like the Chickaferdy that crops up in there.
Yeah.
Me, Mr. Mustard, you know, which John wrote in India in 1968. It's classic Lennon, because he's taken the whole idea from a news story. We read a news story in the papers about a real person called John Mustard. He was living in Enfield in London. He's a Scottish man, sadly, because that reinforces the stereotype of mean Scotsman. And he was being divorced by his wife for being exceptionally mean and frugal. He did shave in the dark to save power, and insisted they listen to the radio in the dark because there were no pictures. The judge found that Mrs. Frida Mustard's life was made unendurable by his stinginess. And so that was real. Mr. Mustard was real. And his sister Pam is mentioned there. That's just a link to the next track. Polythene Pam is really interesting. It seems to be based on two people. There was a cavern dweller, one of their fans in the early days in Liverpool, called Pat Hodgett. And she apparently used to eat polythene. But it's also based on this really quite racy evening, I think, that John had when the Beatles played the Channel Islands, and they were in Jersey. And John met the poet Royston Ellis, who I think he'd known him before. and he had a girlfriend called Stephanie, and they had a bit of a kinky threesome with her wearing polythene. Apparently they were talking about finding some leather, but they couldn't find any leather, so they used polythene instead. So so Polythene Pam is kind of a story of two different women. Quite interesting, and just tremendous fun. And John is playing his 12-string Framus Hootenanny guitar on there, which has a great sound to it, a kind of raucous sound about it. And I think it was at this point, that John, because he was contributing these bits to it. I mean, in the early days of the medley, he wasn't too keen on doing it. But I think when he started contributing, he quite got into it. I mean, what's wonderful about the medley as well is the way they link the tracks together. And that's all four members of the band working together to, and coming up with ideas for how to link one track to another. And I think it's a great job, really great job. And it kind of inspired legions of prog rock bands in the future, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So then Golden Slumbers, Now, this is interesting because back at Twickenham, when they were doing the Get Back project, in the winter, Paul had been writing and rehearsing Golden Slumbers on the piano, and he immediately followed it each time with Carry That Weight. So, he's got these two songs fused together in his inimitable style. And I think that was the seed of the medley, really, those two songs. They kind of had a go at those in the studio. And then the rest of the medley started coming together. But it famously, it came from a sheet of music on the piano that his stepsister Ruth was playing. Apparently it was a song called Cradle Song. It wasn't called Golden Slumbers, although Golden Slumbers is part of the lyric. And he could not be able to read music at that point. He created a new melody for a few lines of the lyrics there. So, but it's been pointed out that, it's got a very beautiful lullaby type verse, and then you burst into a very loud chorus, Golden Slumbers, which would wake any baby. But what a lovely song. I spoke recently to Michael Lindsay Hogg, who was director of Let It Be, and I asked him what his favourite Abbey Road song was. He said, I'm a sucker for Golden Slumbers because it's great and touching, the lyrics and their voices. So he loves it. He loved that song. And he would have heard it, at Twickenham quite a lot by that time. My personal favourite on this album at the moment, it changes, but it's She Came In Through the Bathroom Window.
Yeah. Because,
it's just terrific fun, and it goes into this fantastic rocky section, that sort of One Sweet Dream section, everything. And the guitar playing on it is just ace. Yeah. And I just love the whole of it. I love putting those drums on it again.
The sound.
And then it takes you through its various movements right into the end.
Yeah.
Which is amazing in its own right, because they just decided to play guitar solos together, just giving themselves a few bars of to just stretch out on guitar. Paul's playing his Fender Esquire guitar. George is playing his Telecaster. John's playing his Epiphone Casino again. And they play in this order. Paul plays some lines, George plays, and then John plays, and they repeat that sequence. They actually lined their amplifiers up in the studio and played live. And all the parts were recorded on one track, apparently. The end became really complicated because they wanted an orchestra on it as well. And the studio boffin Alan Parsons had to mix the orchestra on a different machine and combine it. I think it's called. He had to mix it wild. He had to do it and somehow live combine the two recordings to make the finished result, which is quite an amazing feat. But the Beatles always worked with really talented people who could do stuff like that. It was like putting the two bits of Strawberry Fields together. Strawberry Fields Forever together. Um, and so and the end is a beautiful thing. And Paul was thinking of Shakespeare when he wrote that, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. But it's a little bit Shakespeare, a little bit Buddha, isn't it? Really, it's a sort of a very karmic line that, and one of the most profound things he ever wrote, I think.
It's a perfect way to close the Beatles, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Then you've got Her Majesty at the end, which are originally between Me, Mr. Mustard, and Polythene Pam, but they didn't. I think McCartney in particular didn't like that sequence. It didn't quite work for him, so he cut it out and told the engineer, a guy called John Kurlander, to throw away the tape. And thank heavens he didn't, because it's a nice it's a nice little ditty at the end that comes as a complete surprise. When people bought the album and looked at the track listing as they were listening to it, would sort of spat their coffee out. They didn't see that one coming.
It's not there.
And it's been said it sounds a little bit George Formby. It's got a George Formby influence. He was another great Liverpudlian, of course. So that's a really, really quirky little ending there for the album. And overall, I just think it's a glorious piece of work. It's and if only they'd done another. But we can always go back to side one when side two finishes, can't we? We can, which I recommend people do. Just put it on a couple of times.
Absolutely.
Because you hear new things all the time. Listen to Ringo's drums. Listen to the way the bass sort of swoops and dives. It's and the harmonies on, because I can listen to that on repeat. It's just absolutely stunning. So yeah, it's such a joyful album, and nobody really expected the Beatles to give us some joy at the end of their career, but they did. The cover, of course, they went out and they were talking about going up to Mount Everest, actually flying, and standing on Mount Everest and having a picture taken. That would have been an interesting cover. They can do it easily now using Photoshop if they want to, but decided, it's a bit like the Rooftop, isn't it? We're not going to be. We're not going to be doing a concert in Libya or Egypt or on the moon. We're going to do it on the roof of our office. Yeah. So they did the same thing here. Let's do the cover in the street in Abbey Road, and they did it across the zebra crossing, which is quite sad at the moment. If you look at the camera on zebra crossing, it's empty. But normally in normal life, that crossing is thronged with tourists. And the other interesting things about that, the cover that people don't tend to know, is in the centre. If you draw, don't spoil your album, but if you draw a straight line from two straight lines from the diagonals, where they meet, the absolute centre of the album, you see a little car, and that's being driven by a chap called Alan Brown, who worked at the studio. He worked on special projects at the studio. He did stuff like design of logos, design of the Abbey Road logo and stuff like that. I spoke at one point years ago. I spoke to David Holly, who was general manager at Abbey Road then, and he told me, that car is being driven by Alan Brown. He was a lovely guy who worked at the studio. The other interesting thing about Alan Brown was that he believed fervently that Abbey Road studios were built on intersecting ley lines, which was picked up by Kate Bush, who thought it was, wow, that's amazing as well. And when she loved those studios as well. And the other thing on I mean, obviously there's Paul's bare feet and everything, which people go on about. There are, if you look just above Paul's head, you see three men in white coats, and they are decorators. They're painters and decorators. They were working at the studio at that point. And Derek Allen and Steve, they are, and they come from Fastenage, Son and Norris. It's often misprinted as Morris. Derek Allen and Steve are Fastenage, Son and Norris, and they were based in Uxbridge, but they were working that day, and they thought, oh, hello, let's have a look. Something's going on here. Let's have a look. And apparently the photographer waved at them to get out of the way, but they didn't. They decided to stay put, but they didn't know until sometime later. It might have been years later that look, we're on this album. We haven't seen. It's amazing. I remember that day. And a similar thing happened to Paul Cole, who was look on the right hand side. You see the guy in the jacket. He was an American tourist in London with his wife. His wife had gone into a museum, I think. I don't know. I've been trying to figure out which museum she could have gone in, but he was waiting for her to come out. He said, "I've seen enough museums," and he was the vehicle that he's standing next to apparently is a police van. So he's chatting to a policeman, as an American tourist will, go, hey, having just passing the time of day with this policeman.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to figure out where his wife could have gone. That just around the corner in Grove End Road, I think it was the Institute of Archaeology. They might have had an exhibition on or something. Just around the corner in another road was an art gallery. So she might have gone in there. But he was bored by that time with museums in London, and he was just biding his time out there. And about a year later, his wife back in America was playing something, I think, on the organ and learning something and listening to the album, and the cover was on their record player, and he saw himself for the first time. That's me. In an alternate shot of that cover, the one where they're walking the other way over the zebra, it looks as if he's looking at his phone. He's looking down at something. I think he's looking at a notebook or his wallet or something. But these days, you think he's looking at his phone. But obviously, mobile phones didn't exist then. But there's lots of great. You could talk endlessly about that cover. I haven't even mentioned the Volkswagen Beetle or anything, and all the stupid nonsense about Paul is dead. We won't talk about that.
Yeah,
it's absolute balderdash.
The band's name's not on the album cover either.
No, that's fantastic, isn't it? I love the idea. It's a visual statement. You recognise the four guys, despite the fact that their physical appearance has changed so much over the years.
Yeah.
You recognise them. It's iconic, isn't it? It's an image, an international image that doesn't need any words.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, images that don't need any words. It's just fantastic things.
Thanks so much for your time. It's great to do this at this very weird time.
Yeah. I mean, when it's all over, we'll be cheering and celebrating in the streets. And I was playing Come Together this morning and thinking, no, it's exactly what people can't do. They can't come together. Anyway, all the best, Jason. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tony. Much appreciated. Thanks
Cheers
a lot.
then. Bye-bye.
The Cat Club would like to thank Jason Barnard and Tony Barrell for that marvellous interview. Happy trails.